KPFA's own Sabrina Jacobs is our host. You may recognize her name, perhaps her voice, as KPFA's host and producer of the program entitled A Rude Awakening, Mondays at 3:30 p.m. I assure you, Sabrina is anything but rude, but she is lively and engaging. She's also a contributing producer to the program Flashpoints. She's a staff representative on the local station board of KPFA, and she tells me she's very, very proud to be hosting another KPFA event with tonight's two amazing guests. So let's welcome Sabrina Jacobs.
It's an amazing book. Thank you, Miss Catherine Horsley. Appreciate that. Warm, warm welcome. David Talbot. I've racked my brain for about a day trying to figure out what I can say about this man that you don't already know and appreciate about him. I have no witty anecdotes like our brave General Manager Quincy McCoy, since I just met him about a half an hour ago. A trailblazer of internet periodicals, that's a known fact. A brilliant historian and author, that's also a known fact. Cherished darling of the left, it's also a known fact. But one thing that stuck out about me, or about him to me, is that he made a choice. He chose to become a beacon of hope within and out of the murky depths of mainstream media. As a privileged Caucasian man, he could have done pretty much anything he wanted to do. But he made the decision to expose the injustices of our government and the hypocrisy of those that tell those lies every day. He stands on the front line just like the activist and teacher Yvette Falarca, and dares anyone to refute the truths he uncovers in his books, like The Devil's Chessboard, Brothers, The Hidden Story, or Hidden History of the Kennedy Years, Devil Dog, and of course his latest co-authored piece, Unspeakable, Chris Hedges on the Most Forbidden Topics in America. Please welcome the first of our esteemed guests for the evening, a Bay Area sweetheart and founder of Salon.com, Mr. David Talbot.
Well, I couldn't quite hear all of that, but what I heard, Sabrina, was making me blush. Thank you very much. And thank you all for coming out post-debate tonight. I assume some of you heard or saw debacle number 3. But tonight I hope we can uplift the political dialogue a little bit. I certainly know we have the right guest to help us do that tonight. I've been reading Chris Hedges, like I'm sure most of you, for many years now. His byline always stood out to me when he was a ink-stained wretch working for the daily press, including the New York Times, the belly of the beast. It was a cut above, or at least one cut above, what we were getting, particularly from foreign coverage in the Middle East, the Balkans, and so on. So it was no surprise to me when Chris burned those bridges famously with his speech soon after Bush's invasion of Iraq to a small college in the Midwest, in which he told it as he saw it. He told the truth, they pulled the plug on him, and he was soon out of the New York Times. But the New York Times loss was, of course, the rest of our gain. Chris has gone on to a stellar career as a truth-telling author in one book after the next. And I knew when I started my series Unspeakable for Hot Books that he was the first person I had to sit down with and have an extended conversation with, because despite the acuity of his thinking and his reporting, Chris has been largely frozen out, as you know, from the mainstream media. When there is yet another calamity in the Middle East, despite his years of knowledge and experience there, he's never called by NPR or PBS or the cable news shows, or his old employer, for that matter, the New York Times, to comment. And so what he does is continue to speak the truth through his writing, his speaking, and to people like you directly to audiences like tonight. And so tonight we're going to let it rip. We're going to talk about taboo subjects. We're going to talk about things that you're not seeing right now on CNN and MSNBC, right? Yes, and with that, I am proud, very proud, to welcome Chris Hadges to our stage.
Thank you.
Well, Chris, I know we're not going to dwell too much on this tonight, on the carnival that is the campaign 2016, but obviously it is on our minds tonight, so I want to talk a bit about it. The question I think that a lot of us, particularly here in Berkeley, and people of a certain age feel at this point is, not speaking for you, but trying to intuit, is how the hell, after everything we've been through as activists, as engaged citizens, as people of the 60s generation and younger, how the hell did we come to this turning point in American political life where we have the current race for president? Small question.
COINTELPRO, mass incarceration, consolidation of the media into the hands of half-dozen corporations. Much of those movements, especially by people of color, especially by African-American radicals, as you know, as you've written about, were ruthlessly broken by state power. And I think when you combine that with the assault that has gone on against these populist movements that, as Howard Zinn correctly points out, opened up the spaces in American democracy, the state was quite effective in destroying the mechanisms by which ordinary men and women could express themselves and put pressure on the centers of power. And I've seen it with the Occupy movement, the heavy infiltration by Homeland Security and doing all of the tactics that they use, including creating dissent, demonizing the most effective leaders and pushing them out. And I've had my long battle with the Black Bloc, but I thought the Black Bloc were a gift to the security and surveillance state, and they used it. And so I think we do bear some blame, but I think we also have to be cognizant that the security and surveillance state, which is now the most sophisticated and intrusive security and surveillance apparatus in human history, is quite astute in terms of keeping us under control. I think that the left busied itself with a kind of boutique activism, multiculturalism, all of which I support, inclusivity, but not at the expense of justice. And this was, I think, driven home to me during the Occupy movement, which was, at least in New York, largely college-educated, middle-class kids who got out with tremendous debt and found there was not a place for them in the system and experienced the economic dislocations and the police violence that for decades has been part of the reality of people living in marginal communities, or what Malcolm X would call our internal colonies. And I think that that was an example of how, with the assault of neoliberalism, we had diverted our gaze from what was happening to the most vulnerable among us. We allowed, in essence, mini police states to be created. And Hannah Arendt writes about this in The Origins of Totalitarianism, where she talks about the stateless. She herself, after being held by 3 weeks for the Gestapo, is expelled, stripped of her German citizenship, and expelled to France. And she writes that the plight of the stateless is that, of course, they have no rights in the way that people who live in marginal communities have no rights. And that at that moment, it's very dangerous within a society because rights become privileges, which can be revoked. And she also writes that when you create not just a legal mechanism, but a physical mechanism to carry out the kind of repression which poor people of color now experience, it's very easy, if a population becomes restive, to expand those tactics throughout the wider society. So I do blame the left in part, not exclusively, but I also think we have to acknowledge that the systems of control have become far more intrusive, far more sophisticated, and legally far more empowered in the sense that they can extinguish due process, habeas corpus, and of course, Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act, and as many of you know, I sued the president in federal court over this, initially won, and then in the appellate court, they wouldn't accept my standing, and so it's law. But that overturns the 1878 Posse Comitatus Act, which prohibits the U.S. military from acting as a domestic police force. And in that 2-year legal battle, the lawyers, Carl Mayer and Bruce Affron, actually went to the House leadership, to Pelosi, and said, because they renew it every year, if you will insert into the language of that section that this does not apply to U.S. citizens, we will drop our lawsuit. And of course they didn't, because they wrote it to apply to U.S. citizens.
Let me just briefly take it back to tonight's debate and to Donald Trump, even though it seems pretty clear at this point there was no major, game-changing moment in the debate that Hillary Clinton will be our next president. But it seems clear, and this is part of your longstanding critique, Chris, of the Democratic Party and the liberal elite in general, that it was the failure of the liberal elites that opened the door for a Donald Trump, who you've called, among others, have called a fascist. But it seems in some way that the most grotesque aspect of this current campaign is that it's Donald Trump who has presented himself and been largely accepted by many people as the true insurgent, the true voice of the dispossessed, the deplorables, as Hillary calls them. So in what sense do you feel that Trump did represent, and perhaps even in some legitimate ways, the voice of those dispossessed?
Well, Trump is the dress rehearsal for fascism. Could you find a candidate more imbecilic, more impulsive, more self-destructive, and yet, at least until the last week or so, he was a viable candidate? And we know from the leaked emails, which I think we'll talk about, the Podesta emails, that the Clinton campaign worked as hard as it could to promote what they called them the Pied Piper candidates, Trump, Cruz, and Carson, and worked to get the press to treat them as serious candidates, and hoped that they could be used as a lever to push the mainstream Republicans, like Jeb Bush and others, closer to the lunatic fringe.
And they might have, according to the latest revelations, incited violence at some Trump rallies.
Yeah, that's right. And I found that quite chilling, because having covered Yugoslavia, I watched much the same tactic on the part of a discredited liberal center, where you elevate a buffoonish figure like Trump or like Radovan Karadzic in Yugoslavia. Because the difference between a Romney and a Hillary Clinton, or a Bush, Jeb Bush and a Hillary Clinton, is what Freud used to call the narcissism of minor difference. And they know it. And so, because each are serving empire, the corporate state, the massive security and surveillance system, Wall Street, the fossil fuel industry. And because the American public is no longer being effectively drawn into the culture wars, which was used to define them. I mean, these were politics of fear. On the right, it was, gay people will be teaching your children in the kindergarten, and if you were a Democrat, it's, everybody will have guns.
Scalia will control your sex life.
And it wasn't working. That's what led to the Sanders insurgency, and I would call Trump an insurgency. Richard Rorty in 1998 wrote a book, Achieving Our Country. It was his last book. And he quite presciently pointed out that the college-educated elites, who now largely make up the liberal class, who continued to speak in that language of tolerance and inclusiveness, had done themselves a disservice because they had inverted the core movements that once defined them. For instance, feminism. Is feminism about a CEO at Hewlett-Packard, or is feminism about empowering poor women? And so by essentially elevating, in the case of Obama, a black face, or elevating a woman to run the mechanisms of empire and corporate control, that becomes defined. And what happens is that, and I've spent some time in the South, is that dispossessed white working class, because of the language of the liberal class, believes that they have been disempowered at the expense of people of color, of immigrants, of GBLT people, of whatever. Now, it's not true, and we know statistically, especially since 2008, that the segment of the population that has suffered the most have been African Americans, including, of course, the assault on those African Americans who were once part of the middle class. But because figures like Clinton or Obama continue to speak in that language, it gives credibility to the lie perpetrated by the proto-fascists on the right. And when I was in Montgomery, Alabama, I walked through the streets of Montgomery with Bryan Stevenson, the great civil rights attorney who has spent his life defending prisoners on death row, most of whom, not surprisingly, are poor and black. And Bryan was pointing out all the Confederate memorials. I don't know if anyone's been to Montgomery, but when you drive into the city now, there is a massive Confederate flag at the edge of Montgomery. Half of Montgomery's black. It's where Rosa Parks sat on the bust. It's where King began his ministry. And Bryan said, almost all these memorials have been put up in the last decade, including they had just done a reenactment of Jefferson Davis's inaugural, because Montgomery was the first Southern White House before Richmond, where several hundred white guys had dressed up, and somebody had dressed up as Jefferson Davis in a carriage, and they'd gone through the streets. And I said to Bryan, that is exactly what happened in Yugoslavia, where the economic collapse of Yugoslavia, the despair that it bred, the loss of dignity, the loss of self-empowerment, the loss of hope, gave birth to these mythic narratives, in this case, ethnic chauvinism, because it was all they had left. But once you retreat into that world of magical thinking, where myth becomes history, then you can no longer have a dialogue. If you believe that the Southern Confederacy was about states' rights and protecting the Christian way of life, and not about slavery, there's no longer any verifiable fact, or there are no more verifiable facts by which you can communicate. You no longer have an ideological system based on fact. And I think that's who Trump is appealing to. And it's a legitimate rage and a legitimate anger. And he and the movement has done what all proto-fascist movements do, which is direct that rage and anger towards the vulnerable. Muslims, undocumented workers, homosexuals, liberals, feminists, intellectuals, on and on. And the danger, and this did come up in the debate, is that Trump, at least it appears, it appears that he is willing not to recognize the legitimacy of the vote.
Right.
And
we should explain. So he was asked point blank by Chris Wallace tonight, if you are defeated on Election Day, will you accept the will of the people? And he said, well, we'll have to wait and see, basically. I'm going to have to analyze the results.
And, you know, as many of you know, I'm quite close to Ralph Nader and admire him immensely. I was a speechwriter. I've voted third party since 2000. It's not a streak I'm about to break. And we can talk about that. Strategic voting. I did an hour with Amy on Democracy Now! And Eddie Glaude, who I love. Eddie's a wonderful man, head of the African American. But Eddie talked about strategic voting, and I kind of didn't tangle, but I kept thinking, strategic for who? If they know that we will cave, the moment, it's strategic for them, but it's not strategic for us.
We'll get into that.
And the danger, and Ralph has pointed this out, the danger is that right now you have this enraged, let's call them, you know, Christianized kind of proto-fascist movement, nativists, neo-Confederates, who celebrate the gun culture, attempting to work within the system. And Ralph said, actually, this is the moment, this is the honeymoon period for the left. Because if after this election they really do believe that the system is rigged, and it is rigged, but not in the ways that, of course, Trump says it's rigged, then it will fuel what has always been this very dark undercurrent of, in particular, white vigilante violence, which Hofstadter writes about in his last book, Violence, which goes all the way back to the slave patrols. It's there, and it's very dangerous.
Well, and his calling for people to monitor the polls and so on raises some of those questions. But I guess what is, of particular interest to me is what you just said, that, up until probably 10 days, 2 weeks ago, there was a very good chance that Donald Trump could have been elected the next president of the United States. But it was not the ability of Hillary Clinton and the Democratic Party to mount a counter-argument, economic argument that defeated him, like Bernie Sanders possibly could have. But sex, once again, sort of the magic card in American politics, ironically being used by a Clinton against Trump. That was his downfall. And clearly the poll numbers began to tank immediately after that. He's not been able to recover. Now, on the one hand, you say, okay, this is more, political deceit, the same old game that's often played. But on the other hand, it did reveal a certain truth, I think, about sexual power and men in power. And I think it did truly, for good reasons, revolt a lot of people to hear. It was the voice and that, he and Billy Bush, his wingman on the bus, that I think really did him in. It was not the women who later came so much and testified themselves that he had groped them, but it was hearing his own voice. So we know as reporters, as journalists, this goes on all the time. You and I have covered this stuff. Salon famously entered the fray during the Clinton impeachment when we exposed Henry Hyde's own youthful indiscretions, even though he was like 59 at the time. Henry Hyde, who was sitting in judgment on President Clinton as the head of the House Judiciary Committee. So, this is part of political warfare in America. But to what extent do you think it was legitimate to use this as the issue that in the end was Donald Trump's undoing?
I think it's a legitimate issue, given the level of misogyny that Trump embraces, because what he was expressing went far beyond infidelity and was the celebration of sexual assault. So I also think that there are probably times when Bill Clinton has said it as bad or worse. But
Trump
I
said so.
think that it's legitimate. I think it is legitimate. But you're right. They also knew that, and we don't know the full story but we do know that the Clinton campaign spends a lot of money on investigators.
And it was expertly timed.
Yes. So, but, let's not be conspiracy theorists. Maybe it just appeared.
That's just good politics.
Maybe there is a God. I don't know. So, but I think it's legitimate. I think given that level of yeah.
Okay. Rigged system. You said, so the system is rigged, just not in the way that Donald Trump alleges. What do you mean?
Well, it's rigged because money has replaced the vote. 520 legislators in Washington, every single one of them is a millionaire. Every single one. The last debate was between 4 multimillionaires. Anderson Cooper, worth $100 million. Martha Raddatz, $7 million. Clinton, who knows. And Trump, who knows. Made probably less than all of them. And it's just it's a club, and we're not part of it. And you can see little moments where Trump says, well, I've heard Clinton say worse than that on the golf course. Well, the important part is that he's out on the golf course with Clinton. Or that Hillary Clinton is sitting in the front row on his third marriage, which he was, on Melania Trump. Or that Ivanka's Trump best friend before the campaign was Chelsea Clinton. I mean, it's tribal. It's the oligarchs, the oligarch tribe fighting for the spoils of power.
The cozy corruption of the elites.
And it's like kind of the end of Rome, where you have a few imperial families that trade power back and forth and reward their own. I mean, what was the Democratic convention after they snuffed out Sanders but a giant job fair? I mean, Ben Jealous, who I debated the next day, they're all up there looking for jobs. And the lobbyists are all prepared. As soon as the lame duck session comes back in December, we know there will be a gargantuan effort to pass the TPP, and they have lots of ways to get it passed. And Clinton can then take office in January, and it's already a fait accompli. It's just such a cynical, dark game. And there was that study by the Princeton professor. Remember they did the study on voting, where they said basically, it doesn't matter what constituencies want. It never counts anymore. And this, as I often speak about, our most important contemporary political philosopher, who we lost about a year ago, Sheldon Wolin, and he describes the system as inverted totalitarianism, and I think that is a correct description, and this is spelled out in his book, Democracy Incorporated. But what's interesting now is that we're watching the system of inverted totalitarianism fall apart. And just for those who aren't familiar with the term, inverted totalitarianism, as Wolin explains it, is different from classical totalitarianism in that it doesn't find its expression through a demagogue or a charismatic leader, but through the anonymity of the corporate state. That in a system of classical totalitarianism, you have a party or a system that overthrows a decaying government and replaces it. In inverted totalitarianism, you have corporate forces that purport to pay fealty to electoral politics, the iconography and language of American patriotism, the Constitution, and yet internally have seized the levers of power to render the citizen impotent. And before Wolin died, I asked him, because he said the two most effective forms of social control were access to credit, i.e. subprime mortgages, credit cards. People didn't have credit cards in the 70s. I mean, this is all we forget. Access to cheap credit and access to relatively inexpensive mass-produced consumer goods. He saw those as two very effective forms of social control. So after 2008, I asked him if those are removed, if you don't have access to that credit, or that credit is no longer inexpensive, you're paying 16% or whatever it is, you're being fleeced by your credit card company, and the wages have sunk, as they have for half of this country now, where even the most basic consumer products are no longer affordable. Is it possible that we could see a shift into a more overt form of totalitarianism, more classical form of totalitarianism? And he agreed that without those forms, and I think that's what we're watching. I think that the ideology of neoliberalism has lost its credibility. And we spoke about this in the book with Alexander Berkman, who writes an essay on this. That's always very dangerous for the ruling elite. Once you no longer believe in monarchy and the divine right of kings, it's off to the guillotine. And I think that's where we are.
And you have a blunt-spoken, charismatic, controversial leader who is pitted against someone he portrays as lacking stamina, as weak, a woman. And so that's the kind of face-off that we're seeing in this current race. Thinkers on the left, their one great flaw is they have a very rigorous and accurate and true critique of power, but they don't give people the solutions. They don't present a strategy for change that can give people hope. And Ralph, who I think is from that good old Frank Capra, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, kind of upbeat at 80 years old, God bless him, school of thought, still believes that you can reform Washington. And so his strategy, which I found touching, somewhat inspiring, but a little naive perhaps, was that if we just had one good guy, billionaire, step up and give us $1 billion, we could hire 2 to 3 very savvy activists in every congressional district in America and hire a team of lobbyists in Washington. And Congress is very amenable, he says, knowing these people as he's worked with them year in and year out, different administrations. If they're pushed just as effectively as corporate lobbyists are pushing them in the right direction, there's a good chance, not all of them, that they will go in the proper direction with that kind of organized pressure. So, as I say, it was touching to see Mr. Smith get up there and just try and rally us around this idea. But if you think that's naive, and I assume you do, what can we offer people in the way of some hope, of some kind of path towards a different America?
I think you're right. Ralph believes that ultimately the system is reformable. He wrote a book called Only the Super Rich Will Save Us. It's very big. I did an event at Princeton with Ralph, so I actually read the whole thing. But one of my questions was, please name me a moment in human history where oligarchs ever stepped in to save anyone.
Could you think of one?
No. Because as Aristotle has pointed out, once you create an oligarchic elite that deforms a society to serve their interests, then you have only 2 options. This is Aristotle, and that's tyranny or revolution. I have covered revolutions and uprisings, the intifadas, in the 20 years I was a foreign correspondent. So I've watched day in and day out the mechanics of how they worked. I covered most of the revolutions in Eastern Europe, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania. I covered all the street demonstrations that brought down Milosevic. And what's fascinating as a reporter in those situations is that you know the tinder is there. You know it's there. But no one knows the spark. No one. Lenin actually writes about this. Well, 6 weeks before the Bolshevik Revolution, Lenin is giving a talk in Switzerland saying, those of us who are old will never live to see, You never know. I was with the leaders of the East German uprising in Leipzig on November 9th, 1989. And so these are the people who led it. And they said, maybe in a year we will get free passage back and forth across the Berlin Wall. By midnight that night, the Berlin Wall as an impediment to human traffic did not exist. And I know the tinder is there. I know it's there. Joe Sacco, if you don't know Joe Sacco's work, you should. Footnotes in Gaza is one of the great works on the Middle East. But he and I did a book. We spent 2 years on it called Days of Destruction.
He's an artist.
Yes, he's an amazing artist, but also a brilliant reporter. And he uses his graphic novels. They're scrupulously reported. That's what he wrote. Palestine, which was the book that inspired Rachel Corrie. And we did a book, Out of the Poorest Pockets of America, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, to write about these sacrifice zones, these places that were sacrificed first by unfettered, unregulated capitalism, because, of course, now, planet-wide, we have become a sacrifice zone. And the argument was, you better look closely at what they have done to the vulnerable in Camden, New Jersey, or Pine Ridge, South Dakota, or
Standing Rock.
Yeah, Standing Rock, or the coal fields of southern West Virginia, or the produce fields of Florida, because that's what they're going to do to all of us. And that book, I think, was an attempt to convey the deep dislocation, because part of the crime of the corporate media is that it has rendered all of these people invisible. And one of the reasons, there are 50 pages of illustrations, is that we wanted to make them seen, not just their voices heard in the text, but seen. So the tinder is there.
Yeah, but going back to my original question, Chris, we've defined the problem, and very eloquently, Joe, you, others. But my question is, how do we define this, the way forward? And just waiting for that spark, as you put it, of revolutionary change doesn't strike me as a sufficient strategy.
I don't think we wait, but the book is filled with stories, especially in places like West Virginia, of activists who have resisted. And it gets back to Havel's great 1978 essay, The Power of the Powerless, what he calls living in truth. That when you carry out resistance as a moral imperative, when you do not concede to the practicalities of the political system, you create a kind of nucleus which, in a moment of ferment, can expand. I saw that in Czechoslovakia. I was in the Magic Lantern Theater every night with Václav Havel and Dinsmore and Klaus. And Havel, who from 1978 until 1989 was a pariah, his essays were not published, his plays were not performed, in and out of prison, had that quality of living in truth. And I think that that's why we have to put our energy into movements, whether that's in North Dakota, whether that's Black Lives Matter, whether that's the anti-fracking movement, whether that is this recent prison work stoppage, 30 prisons in America. And in the communique last April, when they announced that work stoppage, they said the only way we're going to break this system of neo-slavery is by refusing to be slaves. And for me, that had a political sophistication that a lot of us on the outside lack. The only way we are going to break the power of the corporate state is by refusing to be slaves.
Well, let's talk about one very famous radical community-based movement right here in the Bay Area. If you haven't already, you should all go to the amazing exhibit at the Oakland Museum on the 50th anniversary of the Black Panther Party. And there was a movement that really did light a spark. And it was amazing to me, some of the things I learned, and I thought I knew a lot about the Panther Party already. But the average age, the median age, was 18 or 19. This was a very young movement. 2/3 of the membership were women. We know about some of the elite leadership, of course, and they had their own problems, several of them, Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, and so on. Bobby less than Huey, I would say. But what we don't know enough of is the people who formed the rank and file of that movement and the Black Panther Party, and the kind of day in and day out work that they did to feed children, school children, to set up health clinics, 2 of which apparently are still operating around the country. Bobby's run for mayor in Oakland, which really I think caused an interesting moment here politically. So how do you, Black Lives obviously sees that, and you could see the connection at this exhibit between the current generation and the older generation, the extent to which the Panthers did inspire the Black Lives movement, and in fact, a number of the people who are associated with that movement are involved in the exhibit. But do you see the Black Panthers as an inspiration? Do you see certain flaws or mistakes they made that need to be avoided in the future? And how do you look at that history, since we're here in the Bay Area?
I think you have to first put the history of the Panthers in the context of the state violence that was being carried out against African Americans in cities like Philadelphia, where Rizzo was on a killing spree, Oakland, and everywhere else. And I remember having a discussion with a friend of mine, Audrey Latulo, who had been in the Panthers and then one of the leaders of the Black Liberation Army in Newark. And I said to Audrey, they picked up weapons in a way that the Panthers didn't. I mean, they were proactive. And I said, Audrey, you couldn't have thought that you would win. And he said, yes, but you don't understand what it was like to be a black man on the streets of Newark, where you could be gunned down in a way that, of course, black men and women are being gunned down at the point of over 3 a day right now. And he said, once we picked up a weapon, the whole demeanor of those police changed. And it was a way of, and I think I think it's always the state that determines the configurations of rebellion. And one of the things that worried me about the Occupy movement, now the Occupy movement really, when you examine it, was not a radical movement. It was a pretty mainstream movement. And what was the response of the state? It was, under Barack Obama, to heavy infiltration and monitoring, heavy harassment of Occupy activists once the encampments were broken down. In a coordinated federal effort, he shuts them down. Now that for me was very chilling, because a rational response to the Occupy movements around the country would have been a moratorium on foreclosures and bank repossessions, forgiving all student debt, a massive jobs program, especially targeted at people under the ages of 25, and a rational health care system that is not going to be called Obamacare.
That sounds like the... It sounds like much of the 10-point Black Panther Party program.
Yeah, sure. That's rational. But the state didn't respond rationally. In the same way that the state didn't respond rationally to the indiscriminate violence that was being carried out on the streets of our cities in the 1960s. Black people have always been killed like this. It's only now they've been filmed. It's not new. Ask any black person. Police have been killing black people like this since black people came over here. And, but now they're caught. And I just read Heather Ann Thompson's book, which is very good, on the Attica Uprising. And the reason it's so good, and not only that it's a great history, but she exposes the blueprint for state control. I mean, the way that black people are demonized, the way they appeal to white supremacy, the way the state troopers killed indiscriminately and then falsified all of the evidence and hid the ballistic tests. And but in the book, we have from the Nixon tapes the response to the Attica Uprising. And both Nelson Rockefeller, the governor of New York, and Nixon were convinced that the Attica Uprising, which was about the most basic conditions, they were only given one roll of toilet paper and one bar of soap, I think, a month. They were one shower a week, no educational programs. So they wanted the most basic programs to be treated with some kind of dignity. I mean, it's quite interesting that it wasn't a particularly, none of these demands were outrageous, and yet Rockefeller and Nixon were terrified that this was the moment of a revolution. Those are the words they used. And in the Nixon tape, after the 500 the prisoners who had hostages had no weapons, and they storm over 500 state troopers and sheriff deputies using dum-dum bullets, which are banned under the Geneva Convention, go in and shoot 130 people, and all of the guards who were killed by state trooper fire. But Nixon in the tape says that that was a good thing because, like Kent State, it teaches them a lesson. Like Kent State, it was 9 unarmed students, 4 of them killed, shot dead by the National Guard. And that's why the book is a good piece of history, because as Thompson says at the end of the book, not only has it not changed, it's gotten worse.
Chris, you've been very eloquent in your description of what Noam Chomsky has called unpeople. These are the people who are the scapegoats, the deplorables who are ignored and demonized by society, whether they're the incarcerated or, in the case of the major political issue in my hometown, San Francisco, the homeless. And so now you have, for instance, I was talking to Chris about this backstage, a ballot measure in November in San Francisco, Proposition Q, that poses itself as housing, not tents. But it authorizes the police to take aggressive action against the homeless. The one shred of material they have against the elements is these tents that are now being used by homeless encampments in the city. And so this authorizes the cops, and not just authorizes, it mandates that the police go in and strip these tents away from the homeless. That measure is being backed and funded, and it's a very well-funded campaign, by Silicon Valley billionaires who live in these lavish mansions in Pacific Heights overlooking the San Francisco Bay. And, of course, they pose as, great, defenders of the people and so on. First, do no evil. Is that the Google phrase? Do no harm. So how does that process work exactly, in which a society comes to accept that significant sections of the population are not people that we could empathize with or see ourselves as being there but for fortune go you or I? Phil Oakes wrote in the 1960s a song made famous by Joan Baez. And there's certain people, obviously, who aren't able to put themselves in the shoes of others, whether it's prisoners, behind bars, or people on the streets. How does that process work in America? How does it get reinforced by the media and by our political leaders and by Silicon Valley billionaires?
Through systems of mass indoctrination, where all of those elements are demonized and blamed for their own oppression. And that's done very effectively. And it's done in a very insidious way. It's done across the cultural and political spectrum. Because the mantra that is repeated, whether that's in Hollywood or on Oprah or the Christian right or positive psychologists or Tony Robbins or anywhere else, is that if you dig deep enough within yourself and grasp that you're exceptional, you can have everything you want. Reality is not an impediment to what you desire. And if you don't get it, then something's wrong with you. Barbara Ehrenreich actually wrote a book about this that was quite good. So that's the problem. And we've drunk the Kool-Aid. And so there is this kind of belief, even sometimes among the oppressed themselves. I mean, I say to my students in the prison, almost all of whom are African, they'll say, well, New Jersey, by the way, is one of the most segregated states in the nation. Camden, New Jersey, per capita, the poorest city in America, which Sacco and I was one of the cities we focused on in the book. 98% are people of color. So in Camden, which the schools are dysfunctional, they'll say, well, nobody ever called me a racial slur, nobody. And then I said, look, you have to look at the school you went to, and then you have to drive to Princeton and look at the school all those white kids are going to. That's how racism works. That's how institutional racism works. And what's so heartbreaking for me about teaching in the prison, and I wrote a column about it called The Intellectuals. Actually, it's a talk I gave to the APSA, American Political Science Association. But it's called The Intellectuals We Abandoned. If you get into a prison, as anyone who's worked in a prison know, in every class there are intellectuals, of course, of great stature. And the intellectual class in prison will turn their cells into libraries. And I've taught at Princeton, I've taught at Columbia. My best students, my core best students in any class in Princeton in a prison, could bury any kid at Princeton. Because the understanding of power, the understanding of empire, the understanding of race, they're at such a higher level. I was teaching Du Bois, who I think he's amazing. Maybe you could argue perhaps our greatest intellectual. But he has this notion of the talented tenth. And so I was teaching my class, and they said, well, we're not the talented tenth. This is the idea that the talented tenth of African Americans like Du Bois get doctorates at Harvard and other people are carpenters. And they said, well, we're not the talented tenth. And I said, well, let me tell you why Du Bois is wrong. I had been invited somehow to give a talk at a large church for Peace and Justice Sunday. And this was a upper-class, white, suburban church. And when, in the middle of my sermon, I started saying that we had decapitated far more people, including children, through our militarized drones, aerial bombardment attacks, and missiles than ISIS had ever decapitated. That's when they started walking out. And I said to my students, I say that to you and you get it. You know, you understand the dark side of capitalism and of empire. I mean, the most astute critique of empire throughout American history has come out of the black prophetic tradition. Because, and Cornel West makes this point in Black Prophetic Fire, which is a good book. And it's because they, internally have felt the repression, that they can understand what it means to be an Iraqi, an Afghani, a Vietnamese. And within the prison, there is that sophistication about power. But what's so heartbreaking is that these people, and we're talking about very, very people who have so much to contribute. Not only are they locked away, many for life, but they were never given the chance. And because the situations in which they grew up, their fight or flight mechanisms were triggered as children the moment they got to the street and saw the police pounding somebody, it's heartbreaking. I had one student, most of my students don't get out, but I had one, I met him at the gate. He had 11 years in prison, brilliant. He's now an honors student at Rutgers. And I met him at the gate. The guy's 11 years in prison. I meet him at the gate with his mother at 7 in the morning. And the first thing he says to me, after 11 years in prison, is, I have to rebuild my library. That's the first thing he says. And that's why I stay in the prison, and that's why I get so angry. Because you have these elite institutions like Harvard or Princeton. I just was at USC last night, another bastion of the 1%. And these kids, they're brain dead. They allow authority to define them. They seek to become part of the 1% if they're not already in the 1%. They go to schools to get branded. And of course, these schools are run like corporations. They have become corporations.
I think that's one reason, Chris, why you've developed the way you have. We talk about this in the book Unspeakable, which is available in the lobby. What made Chris a radical? And there's some symmetry here between your own background and mine. We were both middle-class kids sent to elite prep schools, and we saw what class was firsthand, and we were not very impressed. Or we were impressed in the wrong ways. So talk a bit about how that experience, being this middle-class kid, being in these very elite kind of settings, how that shaped your thinking about the elites in this country.
Well, it was an involuntary exposure to the world behind the closed doors of the uber rich. And I went to boarding school when I was 10 on scholarship, and I would go to these mansions and watch boys my age order around adults, the cooks and the chauffeurs and the butlers. And I saw that, not only that sense of entitlement, but that sense of disdain for everybody who was not part of that elite world. Utter disdain for the middle class, utter disdain for the poor, incapacity for empathy. And what also always shocked me was the bottomless greed, that they never had enough. It didn't matter how rich they were. It was never enough. And one of the things I'm sure you experienced is the moral and intellectual mediocrity of the elites. And when Boris got out of prison, we were in New York. I said, I'm going to take you to the Harvard Club and show you how affirmative action works. Because it works really well for rich white people. They go to these prep schools where their fathers went or their grandfathers went. C. Wright Mills writes about this quite, I think, brilliantly in The Power Elite, where he says that it is this whole acculturation. They speak in a kind of code, really, a very subtle code. This is the story of Gatsby, that Gatsby can never master and will always be locked out from. And what happens is, when you are part of that elite, you get chance after chance. It doesn't matter how many times you fail.
You could be George W.
George
Bush.
W.
You could be
Bush.
Donald Trump.
There you go.
And you could be president.
George W. Bush, who was an alcoholic, went AWOL from the National Guard, which he was, so he didn't have to go to Vietnam, was a cokehead, never had a job till he was 40, and then it was only because he got money to build the Rangers Stadium, taxpayer money, which he then sold. I mean, the guy was a total screw-up, and he's president. And there's an example of how, whereas if you're poor, you're lucky if you get one chance. You don't get another chance, and you may not even get one chance. I mean, in the case of Boris, it's just also a window in how utterly dysfunctional our judicial system is. He's in a room with 11 other people. There is a drug deal. It goes bad. Somebody pulls a gun. He doesn't know the guy who gets shot. He doesn't know the guy. If you don't call 911 immediately, you get picked up under the RICO laws, and you get charged with a murder. Everyone in that room. 11 years in prison. He was a single father, raising his son, had a job. He was a foreman. What happens? He goes into prison. His son's life is destroyed. His son is now in jail. And that's what happens. And I just watch over and over. I mean, the cruelty and injustice of this system, 94% never go to trial. They're forced to plea out.
And a member of my family who happens to be African American got arrested in San Mateo not long ago. He was coming home from a party. He wasn't driving. They found some drugs in the back of the car in a trunk. He didn't even know they were there. He ended up being kept for several days at San Mateo, and it was described to me as the Deep South. This is just south of San Francisco, San Mateo County. You go in for the arraignment, and you see these men shackled in their orange suit, all black and brown, two white guys, dirt poor, homeless, came in. They were literally railroaded. They didn't know how to plead. There was no lawyer to talk with them. Someday, just to see how American justice works, you should go sit in a courtroom and see how people are processed, human beings are processed in this country.
Yeah, I mean, whatever happened in that prison, they're all in there unjustly because they never had a right to a trial. They never had a right to a decent defense. I have one student, I know, he did not commit the crime, that he was the U.S. Army welterweight boxing champion. He was going pro. They picked him up. There was a murder. They just do a dragnet. They picked him up. He wasn't even in the city when the murder took place. They clean up a few drug dealers, put them in the Holiday Inn, give them a little money, and they just lie. That's how a lot of these people get railroaded in poor communities. And the tragedy is that he wouldn't take the plea because he said, I didn't do it. I'm not. And 15 minutes with a public attorney who tells him to plead self-defense, and when he gets to the courtroom, he finds out the guy was shot in the back. And he's got a 30-year sentence, and he can't get out. I got another guy in there, 14 years old. He's picked up, there was a knifing. His mother was beaten to death by his stepfather in front of him. He literally cradled his mother as a 12-year-old boy while she died. He lives on the streets. He's running with a gang. There's a murder. They grab him. They haul him to the police station. He's there till 3 in the morning. He's crying. They won't let him see anyone, not a lawyer, not a relative, nothing. They force him to sign a confession. He goes to the county, and you can sit in those counties for 2 years before you go to trial. He sits there till he's 16. He's not eligible to go before a parole board until he's 70 years old. And he's my best student. He's 39 now. I taught a course on...
How long? He's been in how long?
From 14 to 39. He's brilliant, and he works so hard. And I taught a course on conquest. It's great. The one good thing about living in an illiterate culture is that if you show the books to prison authorities, they just look at the cover. So I taught a course on conquest, and I taught Open Veins of Latin America, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and C.L.R. James's Black Jacobins. And I gave my class the syllabus, and there was a week that I wasn't there. I was giving a talk in Montana. And I'm in my hotel room in Montana, and I get a phone call, and they say, this is the Special Investigations Division of the Department of Corrections for the state of New Jersey. Do you know that your students just led a sit-down strike in our prison? And I thought, they read it. They got it.
They're all going to pass the class.
And they go, we think you're behind it. And so I was brought in and interrogated. And, you know, what was so moving about it is that they rose up anyway, even though they knew even better than I the ramifications of it. And the leaders were found, and they were shipped off to another prison. They'll immediately take leaders out of the prison, putting them in isolation. But they rose up anyway. I mean, it was so moving. And I find in that prison a political sophistication, a sense of integrity, a love of the life of the mind. Because, so this student I told you about, after this class, he waited till everyone left the room, and he said, I end the book with this, he said, I know I'm going to die in this prison, but I work as hard as I do so that one day I can be a teacher like you. And that is what we have robbed ourselves of through this
mass incarceration
system of neo-slavery and mass incarceration, which is consciously done to deal with redundant and surplus labor in deindustrialized zones. I wrote a column called Evict the Women and Children and Lock Up the Men. That's what they do. They'll evict the women and children every few months to destroy the cohesiveness of community and the lives of those children.
And to take their property.
And they lock up the men.
To gentrify their communities, yeah. Let's talk about something a little more cheery, the Middle East. The Middle East is a region you know something about, Chris. You covered it for a number of years. We are at permanent war there, it would seem. There's no serious discussion of it in the presidential campaign, how we're going to extricate ourselves from this morass that we created. What would a rational, sane U.S. policy in the Middle East look like?
End the occupation of the Middle East. It's really that basic. They don't want to be occupied any more than we would want to be occupied. And none of this is going to end until we stop occupying them, which means complete withdrawal. Now, unfortunately, because of the disastrous interventions that we have carried out, we have destroyed the fabric, the social fabric of huge swaths of the Middle East, Libya, Syria, Iraq, and created these failed states, which has given birth to this kind of frightening jihadism and fundamentalism and violence. But we forget that what 15 years of state terror will do. When the Jordanian pilot is captured and put in a cage and burned to death, we do not acknowledge that through saturation bombing we are incinerating whole families day in and day out. And what's done to that pilot is certainly barbaric and cruel. But on a moral level, it's no different from what we do every day.
And there's a madness that must be unleashed in any society from that very bombardment.
Of course.
Look what happened in Cambodia.
Right.
The Khmer Rouge was a direct outgrowth
And
of that.
that's right. And that's what always happens. And what happens is that when you essentially terrorize people over a long period of time, they will react in the only form that is given to them to react. They don't have an air force, but they can send suicide bombers to Paris or to Brussels. And what is so disturbing, remember, in the last year, we have given $1 billion worth of arms to the quote-unquote Syrian rebels. Well, I've worked in those anarchic, chaotic zones. This whole idea of moderate rebels is insane. If there are any moderate rebels, I suspect they have a lifespan of about 24 hours. There's a reason Baghdadi moved to Syria, because it was an arms bazaar. The Qataris, the Saudis, all the arms from Libya. That's what the attack, by the way, in Benghazi, that's where they were shipping all the Libyan arms up through Turkey back into Syria. And, I mean, the ISIS, they're all driving Humvees. And what's so myopic about it is that the violence that created it becomes the solution. And there is no vision. There's no end point. Has anybody ever explained to you what the end point is, where we're going? And I think that
Well, the pushback now, of course, is Russia has become the great specter. And so you have even a progressive foreign policy expert like Michael Clare, who I'm sure you know, I heard on KPFA today saying, if we withdraw, we withdrew precipitously under Obama early in his administration, he said, and so the Russians moved in. How do you respond to something like that?
Well, the people who are pushing the let's go to war with Russia line are Robert Kagan and all the neocons who gave us the gift of Iraq. And that worked out really well. I think that the whole expansion of NATO, because it makes no sense in terms of national, it makes no sense. I mean, arming Latvia, I mean, and I was just in Poland, which is like Hungary, essentially a kind of Catholic fascism. I think it's all, you get off the airport in Warsaw, and the first big illuminated advertisement I see is from Raytheon, in partnership for peace, or whatever they say.
Huge military contract.
Yeah, and so what happened is that with the fall of the Berlin Wall, Reagan made a commitment to Gorbachev that we would not expand NATO beyond Germany. But of course, Raytheon and Northrop Grumman and everybody else, they want the arms markets. And so they push the expansion of NATO, which makes no sense in terms of antagonizing Russia, carry out a coup d'etat in the Ukraine. And what happens is that as these economies, under the twin assault of militarism and neoliberalism, because the East European countries are a wreck. 2 million Poles work overseas, and it is a descent. I would spend a lot of time with the Solidarity activists who created the Polish Revolution and are now demonized by the right-wing government. Lech Walesa is described now on state media as the Soviet agent, Lech Walesa. And
the leader of Solidarity.
Yeah, the leader of Solidarity. And so what you're building is an economically dysfunctional system and a hyper-nationalism that needs an enemy, and the enemy becomes Russia. And at the same time, they are expending resources that they don't have to arm themselves to the teeth with American weapons, because if you join NATO, the weapons have to be in sync. You can't, that's the whole point of NATO. And I think much the same is true in the Middle East. It makes no sense to continue what we're doing, but I think a Tomahawk cruise missile is about $1.1 million. So when we attacked Libya, we dropped 133 or something in the first few days. Well, they just made $500 million. And they get to make a bunch of them again. And I think really it has come to be something that crude, where our foreign policy is driven.
There's an economic stimulus.
By a form of economic stimulus for the arms industry.
For an economy that's been thoroughly militarized, we don't have just a military-industrial complex anymore. It's much more pervasive than that. Much of the economy is militarized. So you have the situation then where, again and again, America is in a state of war. At this point, it's permanent war. And every crisis that gets ratcheted up is done with the collaboration of the media. Even the great voice of liberal newspapering, the New York Times, your former employer. So they jumped on board, of course, the Iraq War bandwagon with the WMD coverage. And now they've bought completely into this Cold War II madness. What is the mechanism that goes on there in the world of corporate media? You've worked with these people. You know that they're often very smart people. They see through bullshit often as, that great sort of newsroom reporter sensibility that you can sense when you're being lied to or bullshitted by people in power. And yet, when push comes to shove, whenever there's another foreign crisis like one that's being ginned up now with Russia, the New York Times, the Washington Post, they all jump right on board.
Well, because they're all, again, this goes back to C. Wright Mills, they're all part of that inner fraternity, which believes that they're far more gifted and far more intelligent. I mean, David Halberstam's the best and the brightest, and the rest of the rubes out there don't know it. So you may be a reporter covering foreign affairs for the New York Times, but you're having lunch at the Council on Foreign Relations. An off-the-record lunch. They are embedded in that policy world. And the very astute policy makers are very good at cultivating, massaging the egos of the press. And there's really two types of reporters. There are those of us who were overseas, and the narrative that we were writing was not only always at odds with the narrative of official Washington, but was at odds with the narrative propagated by the Washington Bureau, whose primary job was to do lunch. And every foreign correspondent who's any good will tell you that there are powerful forces within the institution that have a vested interest in propagating this.
Whatever the State Department.
Whatever the state, because it's about access. So, I mean, we can talk about Gary, the reporter who committed suicide, who broke the Webb.
Gary Webb, yeah.
Well, how was Webb taken down? The Pentagon went to the New York Times, went to the LA Times, and used those organs to discredit Webb. They never went and actually checked Webb's reporting. They never did any reporting on their own. Why did they do it? Because, and I think here we go to Chomsky, who understands that the role of the liberal elite is to set the parameters of acceptable debate. That's why in a capitalist democracy a liberal class is tolerated. And they become the attack dogs to take down those who do not honor the virtues of the power elite.
And so
one can critique the excesses of the power elite, but not. And so Webb crossed that line, and he was destroyed by the very media entities.
Even though the CIA later admitted
in hearings,
that it was right, but that he was correct in his assessment of what they had done to help the Contras peddle drugs.
Yes, and of course he committed suicide.
Yeah. You yourself are policed that way. It's interesting that people who tend to review you are given the assignment to review your books are people like George Packer, who is, respected widely as a liberal journalist in this country. But he took a very dim view of one of your latest books, Wages of Rebellion, which is a terrific book. So you've had that experience. You don't respond to these people, though, you told me. You don't fire back. And why is that? I mean, I'm more Irish, I guess, than you, Chris. I like a good fight.
Well, no, I like a good fight, but I want to pick the terms of the fight. I don't want them to set the agenda. And first of all, the Times would only give me 4 or 500 words. It's not the New York Review of Books. I'm not going to get, and it took me 200 plus pages to make that argument. I also knew that Packer was reviewing it, so expected that. I mean, Packer, remember, who writes for the New Yorker, was one of the cheerleaders for the Iraq War and went after me by name. And then he does what the kind of liberal elites always do when it's obvious that this has been a complete disaster. He goes, I made a mistake.
Right.
Well, but he didn't make a mistake. He did his job, which is to discredit those outsiders who challenge the dominant narrative. And that's what, of course, he did with my book. Yeah. So I think partly because, I covered Salvador during the Reagan administration where they were always trying to destroy our careers. I dealt with the AIPAC and the Jewish lobby for 7 years in the Middle East. Maybe I've just become kind of numb to it. I just kind of turn around and keep doing what I want to do, and I don't want to get caught up in these arguments with these people or challenge them. I mean, frankly, whatever their public stature, they're moral and intellectual trolls, and I kind of don't want to waste my time with them.
And if you want to read more about these moral and intellectual trolls, you should definitely pick up the book Unspeakable. We won't go into any more of this, but Chris's stories and his analysis of what it's like to work within these large corporate media companies and to navigate that world and still tell the truth is very enlightening. So I highly recommend it. I want to ask just one or two more questions, and I think we're going to then open it up, right, to all of you, your questions. I want to talk about WikiLeaks. I don't know if you happen to see it, any of you out there today, but there was an interesting dialogue between Glenn Greenwald, my former colleague at Salon and a hero, I think, and another terrific journalist, Naomi Klein. And it was an interesting discussion over the ethics, the politics of what Julian Assange has been doing from deep inside the Ecuador embassy in London with the DNC hacked emails. And Naomi took an interesting position. She was critical and thinks that Assange has been too indiscriminate in dumping the emails that he has, that he's clearly vindictive, that he's timing it. She says that a good journalist, is more careful and sifts through the material before it's put out. She also questioned targets like John Podesta, who is one of the primary targets of these hacked emails, the campaign manager for Hillary Clinton, and lesser-known people who, everyday people who work on the campaign who are caught up in these email hacks. She says it's a slippery slope because when you start targeting people like that instead of top government officials and corporate CEOs, then anyone is fair game, including journalists like Glenn Greenwald and Naomi Klein. And she talks about how the climate change movement, for instance, has been indeed targeted by surveillance, private surveillance firms that energy companies have hired and so on. So she just thinks this could become a very dangerous game. Glenn was not quite as, I think he pushed back because I think he realizes, as does Naomi, the great value of these leaks, and sometimes it's the only way you can get any insight into the world of power is through these kind of leaks. So with that long wind-up, Chris, how do you unpack all of this?
It is the security and surveillance state that has made investigative journalism into the centers of power under the traditional means impossible. It is Barack Obama that has used the Espionage Act to shut down people of conscience, whistleblowers, Kiriakou, Drake, and others, who stood up, and Edward Snowden, and Chelsea Manning, and Julian Assange, who stood up to speak a truth about the dark machinations of power that were hidden from the rest of us. And I know from speaking to colleagues at the New York Times that they can no longer carry out those kinds of investigations because no one within the system will speak with them because they all know they're being monitored. And they know that if they were to expose criminal, fraudulent activity, they would have to flee the country like Snowden. And it was really Obama, whose assault on civil liberties has been worse than under Bush. Yeah. And so let's begin from the point that they destroyed one of the fundamental roles of the Fourth Estate, which is to tell the American public what government is doing. And so who is left? It's the hackers. And that's why they are so fierce against the hackers. Because through the back door, that's all we have left. And that's one of the reasons they are not too worried about me because I'm a Luddite. When they got the Snowden documents, they had them, I don't think it's a secret to the security and surveillance state, they keep most of them in Berlin. And so some of the people in Berlin wanted to speak to me, but my computer wasn't encrypted, so they sent down some hacker from New York with dreads whose name was Subverso and like set up Tor, and I mean they're all kind of rolling their eyes, and it's all set up, and we fix a date, and I finally use my encrypted system to communicate with Berlin, and the first response back from Berlin is, dude, your username shouldn't be Hedges. But that's why they go, when I sued Obama, we used Jeremy Hammond's emails from Stratford, which were quite chilling. We used a dialogue that he dumped 5 million emails of a private security firm, Stratford. But in there was an exchange with, it was either the FBI or Homeland Security. They were trying to tie a group called U.S. Days of Rage out of Occupy to Al-Qaeda. And there was a back and forth as to how they could tie it. Has any jihadist website ever posted it? They wanted to tie it to a jihadist group so they could use the terrorism laws against it. And we use that in our court case. So I think we have to recognize that it was the most pervasive security and surveillance apparatus, as I said before, in human history. And when you are watched 24 hours a day by your government, you can no longer use the word liberty. That is the relationship between a master and a slave. And they created that system. And so people of conscience, including Julian and Edward Snowden and Chelsea and Jeremy Hammond, have at great personal risk. Mm-hmm. I mean, Chelsea, she tried to commit suicide. And
they punished her by throwing her in solitary.
And denying her right to be. And these people have. So I'm kind of loath to start critiquing people like Julian Assange, or Chelsea Manning, or anyone else who have fought an unjust system and paid a price that probably none of us in this room would pay.
Along those lines of citizens taking on the national security state, this was an interesting case. What do you think of the Jersey widows, the 9/11 widows lawsuit to pry secrets from the Saudi government? It seemed to kind of create some interesting political alliances. And of course, Congress did indeed side with them against Obama, side with the widows.
Well, having spent 7 years in the Middle East, the two greatest purveyors of terrorism are our close allies, the Saudis and the Pakistanis. And yes, the Israelis. But I'm talking about within the kind of Muslim world. Yes, I'm certainly with you on Israel. And the role that the Saudis have played in furthering Wahhabism and the very dark deals. I mean, Seymour Hersh wrote a very fine account of the killing, or let's call it murder, he was unarmed, of Osama bin Laden.
Execution.
Execution. And Seymour wrote that he was basically, Osama bin Laden was being held hostage in Abbottabad, which is a huge military center, by the Pakistanis. And he was a kind of collateral to keep al-Qaeda from carrying out attacks in Pakistan. In the same way that the Saudis, through the Islamic charities, will give money to groups like ISIS and al-Qaeda as a way to buy, it's a kind of insurance policy to protect them. This was also true, Erdogan was doing this in Turkey until we put a lot of pressure on him. And then, of course, what happened is they carried out the attack at the Istanbul airport. So the whole buildup of ISIS was largely driven by the Qataris and the Saudis. The disastrous aerial assault in Yemen, and we just signed this massive arms deal with the Saudis, what, 38, that's the Israelis, 38 billion, what we give the Saudis, I don't know. And this is a very difficult position for the government because, of course, of the 19 hijackers, 11 of them were Saudis. Mm-hmm. And
there's disturbing evidence in the finally released 28 pages from the 9/11 report that Saudi officials were in touch with some of the hijackers in these various cells in the U.S. So do you think that from what you've seen, there is evidence that there was Saudi involvement in 9/11?
Well, there was clearly Saudi involvement, but, I covered the war in Bosnia, and so I had to deal a lot with the Islamic charities that were funding the jihadists in Bosnia. And they're huge, multi-billion-dollar operations. But once those Islamic charities start handing out money, you don't know where that money came from. You don't know how much of it came directly from the government. But we used to say in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia doesn't have a foreign policy, it just has money. And that's kind of how they deal with it. So they will actually be funding, as I said before, groups like ISIS, groups like al-Qaeda, and allowing them to carry out their damage as long as they leave Saudi Arabia alone. That has always been the modus operandi of the Saudis. So it's not a story I've reported, so I don't have an opinion on it, except to tell you that I find it highly likely, given Saudi Arabia's traditional way of dealing with these groups, that if they did not pass the money, they were certainly aware of that money being passed.
And then, of course, the next question is, given the long-standing relationship and closeness between the Saudi royal court, the Saudi dynasty, and the Bush dynasty, then what was going on there in terms of who knew what and when?
Well, I think George W. Bush was as stupid as he looked. I don't think he was aware of a lot. I think the only thing we can say is that after 9/11, there was clearly a scramble on the part of the Bush dynasty to protect the Saudis and protect the bin Ladens. Yeah. We know that because they flew them out.
And to protect intelligence officials of our own who had blown it.
Right. And that's what they did. They blew it.
Okay. Well, I don't know if anyone's... Yes, thanks.
Very lively conversation this evening. Give these guys a hand. All right. Do you believe Bernie Sanders and his family were threatened by the Clinton machine?
No. I had a conversation with Bernie along with Kshama Sawant the night before the climate march in New York, where Kshama in particular kept pushing Bernie to run as an independent with the argument that we had to step outside the system and walk into the political wilderness in the way that Syriza, which was polling at 4% a decade ago, did to build an alternative movement. And Bernie's answer was, I don't want to end up like Nader. Now, he's not wrong. The Democratic Party would have destroyed him the way they destroyed Nader and turned him into a pariah. But for that reason, I did not support Sanders because he did what he said he was going to do, which is essentially become, I think, a somewhat pathetic spokesperson for the Clinton campaign. And he betrayed his movement. He particularly betrayed the movement at the Democratic convention when they walked out, and I think he missed his moment in history. And he's been 25 years in the Senate. He doesn't want to lose his seniority within the Democratic Party in the caucus, which he has. He doesn't want to lose his Senate seat, and you can be sure that if he defied the Democratic establishment, they would take it from him. But I've seen him on CNN, and they're reading these incredibly demeaning emails, which were leaked, about him and about his campaign and about his supporters. And he's just got to swallow hard and defend it. So I feel that we are just not going to build, a revolutionary movement within the structure of a counter-revolutionary party.
Chris and I have some disagreement about this, and you can read more about it in the book. But I do think that whatever's oppositional that's left in the Democratic Party and outside has to go into opposition mode now. And Roseanne DeMoro said this in the New York Times today, the head of the nurses union. She said, we're going to treat Hillary Clinton as if she's a Republican president. And that's exactly what has to be done.
Well, she is a Republican president. I mean, the brilliance of Bill Clinton is that he transformed the Democratic Party into the Republican Party, and he pushed the Republican Party so far to the right, it became insane.
Can't disagree with that. Which takes us to the next question. Why can't the vast majority of us figure out how to mount an effective response against the control of corporations and government?
I think there are all sorts of groups that are mounting an effective response. They're not covered. We're watching a magnificent response in North Dakota. We have watched... We've watched activists lay on the railroad tracks, stopping the bitumen tar sands coming down on the railway carriages on the West Coast. We have watched courageous boycott, divestment, and sanction movement activists, Students for Justice in Palestine, who are being banned right and left. We are watching, and I spoke to about 400 anti-fracking activists, all kids, young kids. Everybody's a kid to me now. And you know what was moving? They all showed up with their backpacks, and they all had rashes and respiratory problems because they were out in those fracking fields fighting back and suffering the effects from fracking themselves. They're out there. They are out there, and that's kind of where I put my energy now, because they are our hope. They are there, and they're not given a voice, a national platform, but that's on purpose. But they're there.
Yeah, I agree with Chris that I think the domestic movements against corporate exploitation, against police violence, are very inspiring and give me hope as an old guy, older than Chris. But where I'm really very anguished and, scratching my head is where the hell is the peace movement in this country today? After 15 years of permanent war in the Middle East. And, I hate to say this, but I think it's because there's no draft. And I don't think, as long as you have largely a mercenary army doing the country's will abroad, or at least the elite's will abroad, you're not going to have, a mobilized youth base like we did during the anti-war movement during my day in Vietnam. So, that's discouraging.
Okay, Nicole asks if David Soros really gave $30 million to Black Lives Matter, is he truly giving it for altruistic reasons, or is he cynically hoping to instigate a race war?
Is that George Soros?
George Soros. No, she said David Soros. So I think
No,
she meant
David
George.
is his son?
The elites give money to sections of the movements that are not revolutionary. So when Ferguson happened, all these foundations went in there with big packets of cash, deciding who was safe to give money to. And that is a long tradition within the American political system. Why does the NAACP exist? Because it was formed as a counterweight to the Communist Party, which, if you were Paul Robeson or W.E.B. Du Bois, was the only party you could be joined and treated as a full human being. And why was the AFL-CIO created, or certainly funded, with ending up with these troglodytes like George Meany and Lane Kirk? Because the Wobblies had to be destroyed. So I think that these foundation gifts and large amounts of money are often used to defang these movements in a sense that they want to box them in, have them focus on a particular issue rather than broad revolutionary struggle. I think that's always been the case. And the Democratic Party has pretty much of a lock in terms of foundations, Ford and all this stuff. And that's why the really radical movements like the anti-frackers or like the BDS, they're not getting any money at all. They're out there on their own.
The Ford Foundation, I was interested to learn today, is among the benefactors for the Black Panther exhibit at the Oakland Museum. But I'm sure they weren't giving money to the Black Panthers back in the day.
All right, so second to last question. What's really the alternative to the lesser of the two evils? Are Americans ready for revolution?
Yes, because the ruling ideology, and Berkman writes this in his essay, I think it's called The Idea is the thing I quoted in the book, but he's right, that the ruling ideology of neoliberalism no longer has any currency. And so therefore, since we've realized that every promise of neoliberalism has turned out to be a lie, that it creates jobs and middle class and expands democracy and every other, the ruling elites have to use much more naked forms of coercion in order to maintain control. That's why in the streets of our cities, despite all of the courageous efforts by activists in cities like Baltimore and Ferguson, they're not going to stop killing. Because that reign of terror functions in the same way that lynching functioned, as a reign of terror. It's a form of social control.
Yes.
And they need it. And they're not going to give it up. And as broader and broader segments of the population, and we are seeing it, we saw it with the Sanders campaign, we even see it in its sort of mutated form among dispossessed white working class, they don't believe in the ideology. And that has sent the elites into a kind of panic. And so Berkman says that in a sense, essentially what happens at that moment is that you have a subterranean movement where Gramsci writes about it, that it's the interregnum, he calls it, and which gives birth, Gramsci writes, to all sorts of morbid phenomena. But you have this period where we have yet to kind of coalesce around a vision, an alternative vision, and yet that old ideology no longer has currency. And Berkman says it's like boiling water in a kettle. You don't see it until finally the steam and the whistle goes off. And that's what's happening. Now, if we don't coalesce around an alternative anti-capitalist vision, then we will have sporadic outbreaks of essentially nihilistic violence, which the state can quite effectively control and crush.
Or Trumpism without Trump,
Right.
or with a more effective Trump.
Well, that's fascism. I mean, the backlash could very well be a right-wing backlash, which is part of the reason why I want the left to begin to take a stand. Because if we surrender to the Democratic Party, which certainly since 1994 has done nothing but wage war on working men and women, then you are by default going to push them into the hands of the fascists or the Christianized fascists. I wrote a book about it a few years ago called American Fascists, the Christian Right, and the War in America. I was trying to reach out to them. And the conclusion of that book is that the only way to break the back of that movement is to integrate these people back into the economy. If we do not integrate them back, and we, of course, in the name of austerity, more and more have been pushed out, then we're finished. And that's why those of us who are socialists have to begin to stand up for a socialist America, or we're going to end up getting a fascist America.
All right, here's our last question. Is our last hope for citizen democracy on the local levels, city, county, state?
That's a very important question, because one of the most creative and interesting and innovative resistance movements globally has been the Zapatistas, who in 1994, on the day NAFTA was signed, before a lot of us realized, knew instantly what NAFTA was about. And 6 of them went off to southern Mexico and formed this. And they created, these autonomous zones. Now there's a big debate in Mexico, among the left in Mexico, who I think the group Jóvenes de, I forget the name of it, but it's another nationwide group that has carried out a lot of the demonstrations, especially in the north, where all the killings are going on. They said, look, we can create autonomous zones, but eventually the state, once it recovers its strength, can wipe them out. Autonomous zones where people learn forms of self-governance, create alternative forms of, these are very important, but they have to look outwards, not inwards. And so yes, localism is key. And the more that we can create local communities to sever ourselves from the tentacles of the corporate state, the freer we become. And yet at the same time, we can't become too comfortable within these particular zones, because as long as that corporate superstructure remains in power, they can be erased.
Right, because we're fighting global capitalism
right.
when it comes down to it. It's like in San Francisco now, and and I know there's a couple of people here who are part of the movement in San Francisco with me to fight for our city against this huge tidal wave of tech wealth and real estate wealth that has just drowned the city. We're now in a situation where 50,000 people in a city of only 150,000, 50,000 people a year are being pushed out of San Francisco, evicted from their homes, and replaced by, of course, higher paid tech workers. This Airbnb hotels wiping out old entire neighborhoods. So that is happening not just in San Francisco, though, of course, but throughout the world. It's happening in Berkeley and Oakland and Amsterdam and Paris, and so it's an international fight that we have to do. So one idea that I've been floating more and more, and I talked to Tom Hayden about this not long ago, and I was very sad to hear that Tom is quite ill now, by the way. Was hospitalized recently and has roots here in Berkeley, of course. But in any case, I think what we have to really do is start linking up all these community actions, all these separate environmental projects. We need some solidarity. We need to be organized. And we need to be organized on a national level and an international level, just the way that the people we're opposing are.
Yeah, I think that's key. I think that this is a global fight. And part of my argument with people who won't stand up for the Palestinians is that we, especially as members or those who live within the heart of empire, we don't have a right to pick and choose which groups of the oppressed it is convenient for us to build alliances with.
That's right.
We are really at a moment in human history where we stand with all of the oppressed or none of the oppressed.
That's right.
And on a very visceral and personal level, I will never, I don't care how futile it is, vote for anyone who supports the war crimes of Israel, because I've been in Al-Shifa Hospital after Israeli bombings and seen the dead children. And that's where our loyalties have to be. And if we will stand up for the victims of imperial oppression and the victims of corporate oppression within our marginal communities and not waver and not be frightened and not back down, if we lose that fear and we find that courage, then we can win.
A great way to end. Thank you, everybody.